The Last Day, Tuesday, June 6, 1944. Chapter 52. Dita sat on the platform at the Reims railway station. French railwaymen and German troops watched with him, standing patiently under the harsh lights. The prison train was late, hours late, but it was coming. He had been assured of that. He had to wait for it. He had no other cards to play. His heart was full of rage. He had been humiliated and defeated by a girl. Had she been a German girl, he would have been proud of her. He would have called her brilliant and brave. He might even have fallen in love with her. But she belonged to the enemy, and she had outwitted him at every turn. She had killed Stephanie. She had destroyed the chateau. And she had escaped. But he would catch her yet. And when he did, she would suffer tortures worse than her most terrifying imaginings. Then she would talk. Everyone talked. The train rolled in a few minutes after midnight. He noticed the stink even before it came to a halt. It was like the smell of a farmyard, but disgustingly human. There was an assortment of rail cars, none of them designed for passengers. Goods wagons, cattle trucks, even the mail car, with its narrow windows broken. Each was crammed with people. The livestock wagons had high wooden sides, pierced by slats to permit observation of the animals. The prisoners nearest put their arms through the slats, hands open with palms upward, begging. They asked to be let out. They pleaded for something to eat. But most of all, they begged for water. The guards looked on impassively. Dita had given instructions that the prisoners were to have no relief at Reims tonight. He had 2 Waffen SS corporals with him, guards from the chateau, both good marksmen. He had extracted them from the shambles at Santa Cecile. Treading on his authority as a major, he turned to them now and said, "Bring Michael Clariot." Michael was locked in the windowless room, where the station master kept the cash. The corporals went away and reappeared with Michael between them. His hands were tied behind his back, and his ankles were hobbled so that he could not run. He had not been told what had happened at Santa Cecile. All he knew was that he had been captured for the second time in a week. There was little left of his buccaneering persona. He was trying to maintain an air of bravado, to keep his spirits up, but the attempt was a failure. His limp was worse. His clothes were dirty, and his face grim. He looked defeated. Dita took Michael's arm and walked him closer to the train. At first, Michael did not understand what he was looking at, and his face showed only mystification and fear. Then when he made out the begging hands and understood the piteous voices, he staggered as if he had been struck, and Dita had to hold him upright. Dita said, "I need some information." Michael shook his head. "Put me on the train," he said. "I'd rather be with them than with you." Dita was shocked by the insult and surprised Mikhail's courage. He said, "Tell me where the Jackdaws plane will land, and when." Mikhail stared at him. "You haven't caught them," he said, and hope came back into his face. "They've blown up the chateau, haven't they?" They succeeded. He threw back his head and gave a whoop of joy. "Well done, Flick." Dieter made Mikhail walk the length of the train slowly, showing him the numbers of prisoners and the scale of their suffering. "The plane," he said again. Mikhail said, "The field outside La Châtelle at 3 a.m. Dieter was almost certain that was false. Flick had been scheduled to arrive at La Châtelle 72 hours ago, but had aborted the landing, presumably because she suspected a Gestapo trap. Dieter knew there was a backup landing place, because Gaston had told him so. But Gaston had known only its code name, Champ d'Or, not its location. Michael, however, would know the exact place. "You're lying," Dieter said. "Then put me on the train," Michael replied. Dieter shook his head. "That's not the choice, nothing too easy." He saw puzzlement and the shadow of fear in Michael's eyes. Dieter walked him back and stopped at the woman's car. Their feminine voices begged in French and German, some invoking the pity of God, others asking the men to think of their mothers and sisters, a few offering sexual favors. Michael bowed his head, refusing to look. Dieter beckoned to 2 figures standing in the shadows. Michael looked up, and a terrible dread came over his face. Hans Hess walked out of the shadows, escorting a young woman. She might have been beautiful, but her face was ghastly white. Her hair lay in greasy strands, and she had sores on her lips. She seemed weak, walking with difficulty. It was Gilberte. Michael gasped. Dieter repeated his question. Where will the plane land, and when? Michael said nothing. Dieter said, "Put her on the train." Michael moaned. A guard opened the gate of a cattle car, while 2 others kept the woman in with bayonets. The guard pushed Gilbert into the car. "No," she cried. "No, please." The guard was about to close the gate, but Dieter said, "Wait." He looked at Mikhail. Tears were pouring down the man's face. Gilbert said, "Please, Michael, I beg you." Michael nodded. "All right," he said. "Don't lie again," Dieter warned. "Let her out. The time and place. The potato field east of La Roque at 2 a.m. Dieter looked at his watch. It was 12:15. "Show me," he said. 5 kilometers from La Roque, the village of La Epine was asleep. Bright moonlight silvered the big church. Behind the church, Moliere's meat van was parked inconspicuously next to a barn. In the deep moon shadow, thrown by a buttress, the surviving Jackdaws sat waiting. "What are you looking forward to?" said Ruby. Paul said, "A steak." Paul said, "A soft bed with clean sheets. How about you?" "Saying Jim." Philip recalled that Ruby had a fling with the firearms instructor. I thought she stopped. "You thought it was just a casual shag," Ruby said. Flick nodded, embarrassed. "So did Jim," Ruby said. "But I've got other plans." Paul laughed softly. "I'll bet you get what you want." "What about you two?" Ruby asked. Paul said, "I'm single." He looked at Flick. She shook her head. "I intended to ask Michael for a divorce. But how could I? In the middle of an operation." "So we'll wait until after the war to get married," Paul said. "I'm patient." Typical man, Flick thought. He slips marriage into the conversation, like a minor detail. On a level with buying a dog license. So much for romance. But in truth, she was pleased. It was the second time he had mentioned marriage. Who needs romance, she thought. She looked at her watch. It was 1:30. "Time to go," she said. Dira had commandeered a Mercedes limousine that had been outside the chateau grounds, and so had survived the explosion. The car was now parked at the edge of the vineyard, next to the potato field at La Roque, camouflaged with leafy vines torn from the ground. Michael and Gilbert were in the back seat, bound hand and foot, guarded by Hans. Dira also had with him the two corporals, each armed with a rifle. Dira and the riflemen looked into the potato field. They could see clearly in the moonlight. Dira said, "The terrorists will be here in the next few minutes. We have the advantage of surprise. They have no idea that we are here. But remember, I must have them alive, especially the leader, the small woman. You have to shoot to wound, not kill." One of the marksmen said, "We can't guarantee that. This field must be 300 meters wide. Let's say the enemy is 150 meters away. At that distance, no one could be sure of hitting the legs of a running man." "They won't be running," Dira said. "They are meeting a plane. They have to form a line, pointing electric torches at the aircraft to guide the pilot down. That means they'll be standing still for several minutes." "In the middle of the field?" "Yes." The man nodded. "Then we can do it." He looked up. "Unless the moon goes behind a cloud. In that event, we'll turn on the headlights of the car at a crucial moment." The Mercedes had huge dinner plate lamps. The other marksman said, "Listen." They fell silent. A motor vehicle was approaching. They all knelt despite the moonlight. They would not be visible against the dark mass of the vines, provided they kept their heads down. A van came along the road from the village with its lights off. It pulled up by the gate to the potato field. A female figure jumped out and swung the gate wide. The van pulled in and its engine was silenced. Two more people got out, another woman and a man. "Quiet now," Dira whispered. Suddenly the hush was shattered by the blare of a car horn, incredibly loud. Dira jumped and cursed. It came from immediately behind him. "Jesus!" he exploded. It was the Mercedes. He leaped to his feet and ran to the open window of the driver's door. He saw immediately what had happened. Miguel had sprung forward, leaning across the front seat, and before Hans could stop him, he had pressed on the horn with his bound hands. Hans in the front passenger seat was now trying to aim his gun, but Gilbert had joined in, and she was lying half over Hans, hampering his movements, so that he kept having to push her away. Tito reached in and shoved Michael, but Michael resisted, and Dieter's position with his arms extended through the car window was too awkward for him to exert much force. The horn continued to sound a deafening warning that the resistance agents could not fail to hear. Dieter fumbled for his gun. Mikkel found the light switch, and the car's headlights came on. Dieter looked up. The riflemen were hideously exposed in the glare of the lights. They both got up off their knees, but before they could throw themselves out of the beam, there was a rattle of machine gun fire from the field. One rifleman cried out, dropping his gun, clutched his belly, and fell across the hood of the Mercedes. Then the other was shot in the head. A sharp pain stung Dieter's left arm, and he let out a yell of shock. Then there was a shot from within the car, and Michael cried out. Hans had at last flung Gilbert off himself and got his pistol out. He fired again, and Michael slumped, but Michael's hand was still on the horn, and his body now lay over his hand, pressing it down, so the horn continued to blare. Hans fired a third time, uselessly, for his bullet thudded into the body of a dead man. Gilbert screamed and threw herself at Hans again, grabbing at his gun arm with her mangled hands. Dieter had his gun out, but could not shoot at Gilbert for fear of hitting Hans. There was a fourth shot. It was Hans' gun again, but now it was somehow pointing upwards, and he shot himself, the bullet hitting him under the chin. He gave a horrid gurgle. Blood came out of his mouth, and he slumped back against the door, his eyes staring lifelessly. Dieter took careful aim and shot Gilbert in the head. He reached through the window with his right arm and shoved the corpse of Michael away from the steering wheel. The horn was silenced. He found the light switch and killed the headlights. He looked across the field. The van was still there, but the Jackdaws had disappeared. He listened. Nothing moved. He was alone. Flick crawled through the vineyard on her hands and knees, heading for Dieter Frank's car. The moonlight, so necessary for clandestine flights across occupied territory, was now her enemy. She wished for a cloud to shade the moon, but for the moment the sky was clear. She kept close to the row of vines, but she threw a conspicuous moon shadow. She had firmly instructed Paul and Ruby to stay behind, hiding at the edge of the field near the van. 3 people made 3 times the noise, and she did not want a companion to betray her presence. As she crawled, she listened for the incoming plane. She had to locate any remaining enemy and kill them before the plane arrived. The Jackdaws could not stand in the middle of the field with flashlights while there were armed troops aiming at them from the vineyard. And if they did not hold flashlights, the plane would return to England without touching down. The thought was unbearable. She was deeper into the vineyard than Dieter Frank's car, which was parked at the edge. She was 5 rows of vines back. She would approach the enemy from behind. She kept the submachine gun in her right hand, ready to fire as she crawled. She drew level with the car. Frank had camouflaged it with vegetation, but when she peeped over the rows of vines, she saw moonlight glint off the rear window. The shoots of the vines were espaliered crosswise, but she was able to crawl beneath the lowest strand. She pushed her head through and looked up and down the next alley. It was clear. She crawled across the open space and repeated the exercise. She grew ultra-cautious as she approached the car, but she saw no one. When she was 2 rows away, she was able to see the wheels of the car and the ground around it. She thought she could make out 2 motionless bodies in uniform. How many were there in total? It was a long Mercedes limousine and could easily carry 6. She crept closer. Nothing moved. Were they all dead? Or had 1 or 2 survived and concealed themselves nearby, waiting to pounce? Eventually, she crawled right up to the car. The doors were wide open, and the interior seemed full of bodies. She looked in the front and recognized Mikhail. She choked back a sob. He was a bad husband, but he had been her choice, and now he was lifeless, with 3 red-ringed bullet holes in his blue chambray shirt. She guessed he had been the one to sound the horn. If so, he had died saving her life. There was no time to think of such things now. She would ponder them later, if she lived long enough. Next to Michael lay a man she did not recognize, who had been shot in the throat. He wore the uniform of a lieutenant. There were more bodies in the back. She looked through the open rear door. One was that of a woman. She leaned into the car for a better view. She gasped. The woman was Gilbert, and she seemed to be staring at Flick. A ghastly moment later, Flick realized that the eyes saw nothing, and Gilbert was dead, shot in the head. She leaned over Gilbert to look at the 4th corpse. It rose up from the floor in a swift motion. Before she had time to scream, it grabbed her by the hair and thrust the barrel of a gun into the soft flesh of her throat. It was Dieter Frank. "Drop the gun," he said in French. She was holding the submachine gun in her right hand, but it was pointing up, and, before she could aim it, he would be able to shoot her. She had no choice. She dropped it. The safety catch was disengaged, and she half-hopped. The impact of its fall would fire the gun, but it landed harmlessly on the earth. Baccarat. As she stepped back, he followed her, getting out of the car, keeping the gun at her throat. He drew himself upright. "You're so small," he said, looking her up and down, "and you've done so much damage." She saw blood on the sleeve of his suit, and guessed she had ringed him with her stun gun. Not just to me," he said. "That telephone exchange is every bit as important as you obviously believe." She found her voice. "Good. Don't look pleased. Now you're going to damage the resistance." She wished she had not been so fierce in ordering Paul and Ruby to wait in hiding. There was now no chance they would come to her rescue. Dieter shifted the gun from her throat to her shoulder. "I don't want to kill you, but I'd be happy to give you a crippling wound. I need you able to talk, of course. You're going to give me all the names and addresses in your head. She thought of the suicide pill concealed in the hollow cap of her fountain pen. Would she have a chance to take it? It's a pity you've destroyed the interrogation facility at Santa Cecile, he went on. I'll have to drive you to Paris. I've got all the same equipment there. She thought with horror of the hospital operating table and the electric shock machine. I wonder what will break you, he said. Sheer pain breaks everyone eventually, of course. But I feel that you might bear pain for an inconveniently long time. He raised his left arm. The wound seemed to give him a twinge, and he winced. But he bore it. He touched her face. The loss of your looks, perhaps. Imagine this pretty face disfigured, the nose broken, the lips slashed, one eye put out, the ears cut off. Flick felt sick, but she maintained a stony expression. No. His hand moved down, stroking her neck. Then he touched her breast. Sexual humiliation, then? To be naked in front of many people, followed by a group of drunk men, forced to perform acts of grossness with animals. And which of us would be most humiliated by that? She said, defiantly. Me, the helpless victim, or you, the real perpetrator of obscenity. He took his hand away. Then again, we have tortures which destroys forever a woman's ability to bear children. Flick thought of Paul and flinched involuntarily. Ah, he said with satisfaction. I believe I have found the key to unlock you. She realized she had been foolish to speak to him. Now she had given him information which he could use to break her will. We'll drive straight to Paris, he said. We'll be there by dawn. By midday, you will be begging me to stop the torture and listen to you pour out all the secrets you know. Tomorrow night, we will arrest every member of the resistance in northern France. Flick was cold with dread. Frank was not bragging. He could do it. I think you can travel in the trunk of the car, he said. It's not airtight. You won't suffocate. But I'll put the corpses of your husband and his lover in with you. A few hours bumping around with dead people will put you in the right frame of mind, I think. Flick shuddered with loathing. She could not help it. Keeping the pistol pressed to her shoulder, he reached into his pocket with his other hand. He moved his arm cautiously. The bullet wound hurt, but did not incapacitate him. He drew out a pair of handcuffs. Give me your hands, he said. She remained motionless. I can either handcuff you or render your arms useless by shooting you in both shoulders. Helpless, she raised her hands. He closed one cuff over her left wrist. She moved her right toward him. Then she made her last desperate move. She struck sideways with her handcuffed left hand, knocking his gun away from her shoulder. At the same time, she used her right hand to draw the small knife from its hidden sheath behind the lapel of her jacket. He flinched back, but not fast enough. She lunged forward and thrust the knife directly into his left eye. He turned his head, but the knife was already in, and Flick moved farther forward. pressing her body up against his, ramming the knife home. Blood and fluid spurted from the wound. Frank screamed in agony and fired his gun, but the shots went into the air. He staggered back, but she followed him, still pushing the knife with the heel of her hand. The weapon had no hilt, and she continued to shove until its entire 3 inches had sunk into his head. He fell backwards and hit the ground. She fell on him, knees on his chest, and she felt ribs crack. He dropped his gun and clawed at his eye with both hands, trying to get at the knife, but it was sunk too deep. Flick grabbed the gun. It was a Walther P-38. She stood upright, held it two-handed, and aimed it at Frank. Then he fell still. She heard pounding footsteps. Paul rushed up. "Flick, are you all right?" She nodded. She was still pointing at dear Frank. "I don't think that will be necessary," Paul said softly. After a moment, he moved her hands, then gently took the gun from her and engaged the safety catch. Ruby appeared. "Listen," she cried. "Listen." Flick heard the drone of a Hudson. "Let's get moving," Paul said. They ran out into the field to signal the plane. That would take them home. They crossed the English Channel in strong winds and intermittent rain. During a quiet spell, the navigator came back into the passenger compartment and said, "You might want to take a look outside." Flick, Ruby, and Paul were dozing. The floor was hard, but they were exhausted. Flick was wrapped in Paul's arm, and she did not want to move. The navigator pressed them. "You had better be quick before it clouds over again. You'll never see anything like this again if you live to be 100. Curiosity overcame Flick's tiredness. She got up and staggered to the small rectangular window. Ruby did the same. Obligingly, the pilot dipped a ring. The English Channel was choppy, and the stiff wind blew, but the moon was full, and she could see clearly. At first she could hardly believe her eyes. Immediately below the plane was a grey-painted warship, bristling with guns. Alongside it was a small ocean liner, its paintwork gleaming white in the moonlight. Behind them a rusty old steamer pitched into the swell. Beyond them and behind were cargo boats, troop transports, battered old tankers, and great shallow draft landing ships. There were ships as far as Flick could see, hundreds of them. The pilot dipped the other ring, and she looked out the other side. It was the same. "Paul, look at this," she cried. He came and stood beside her. "Creepers," he said. "I've never seen so many ships in all my life." "It's the invasion," she said. "Take a look at the front," said the navigator. Flick went forward and looked over the pilot's shoulder. The ships were spread out over the sea like a carpet, stretching for miles and miles as far as she could see. She heard Paul's incredulous voice say, "I didn't know there were this many ships in the damn world." "How many do you think it is?" Ruby said. The navigator said, "I heard 5,000. "Amazing," Flick said. The navigator said, "I'd give a lot to be a part of that, wouldn't you?" Flick looked at Paul and Ruby, and they all smiled. "Oh, we are," she said. "We are part of it, all right." 1 year later, Wednesday, June 6, 1945. Chapter 53. The London street called Whitehall was lined on both sides with grandiose buildings that embodied the magnificence of the British Empire as it had once been 100 years earlier. Inside those fine buildings, many of the high rooms with their long windows had been subdivided by cheap partitions to form offices for lesser officials and meeting rooms for unimportant groups. As a subcommittee of a subcommittee, the medals, clandestine actions, working party met in a windowless room 15 feet square with a vast cold fireplace that occupied half of one wall. Simon Fortescue from MI6 was in the chair, wearing a striped suit, striped shirt, and striped tie. The Special Operations Executive was represented by John Graves, from the Ministry of Economic Warfare, which had theoretically supervised SOE throughout the war. Like the other civil servants on the committee, Graves wore the Whitehall uniform of black jacket and grey striped trousers. The Bishop of Marlborough was there in a purple clerical shirt, no doubt to give the more dimensions to the business of honoring men for killing other men. Colonel Algernon Nobby Crock, an intelligence officer, was the only member of the committee who had seen action in the war. Tea was served by the committee's secretary, and a plate of biscuits was passed around while the men deliberated. It was mid-morning when they came to the case of the Jackdaws of Reims. John Graves said there were 6 women on this team, and only 2 came back. But they destroyed the telephone exchange at Santa Cecile, which was also the local Gestapo headquarters. "Women," said the bishop. "Did you say 6 women?" "Yes." "My goodness me." His tone was disapproving. "Why women? The telephone exchange was heavily guarded, but they got in by posing as cleaners." "I see." Nobby Crock, who had spent most of the morning chain-smoking in silence, now said, "After the liberation of Paris, I interrogated Major Godel, who had been aide to Rommel. He had told me they had been virtually paralyzed by the breakdown in communications on D-Day. It was a significant factor in the success of the invasion. He thought I had no idea a handful of girls were responsible. I should think we're talking about the military cross, aren't we?" "Perhaps," said Fortescue, and his manner became prissy. However, there were discipline problems with this group. An official complaint was entered against the leader, Major Clariot, after she insulted a guards officer. "Insulted?" said the bishop. "How?" "There was a row in a bar, and I'm afraid she told him to fuck off. Saving your presence, Bishop." "My goodness me, she doesn't sound like the kind of person who should be held up as a hero to the next generation." "Exactly. A lesser decoration than the military cross, then. The MBE, perhaps." Nobby Crock spoke again. "I disagree," he said mildly. "After all, if this woman had been a milksop, she probably wouldn't have been able to blow up a telephone exchange under the noses of the Gestapo." Fortescue was irritated. It was unusual for him to encounter opposition. He hated people who were not intimidated by him. He looked around the table. The consensus of the meeting seems to be against you. Clark frowned. I presume I can put in a minority recommendation, he said with stubborn patience. Indeed, said Fortescue. Though I doubt if there's much point. Clark drew on his cigarette thoughtfully. Why not? The minister will have some knowledge of one or two other individuals on our list. In those cases, he will follow his own inclinations, regardless of our recommendations. In all other cases, he would do as we suggest, having himself no interest. If the committee is not unanimous, he will accept the recommendation of the majority. I see, said Clark. All the same, I should like the record to show that I dissented from the committee and recommended the military cross from Major Clariette. Fortescue looked at the secretary, the only woman in the room. Make sure of that, please, Miss Gregory. Very good, she said quietly. Clark stubbed out his cigarette and lit another. And that was the end of that. Frau Waltraud Frank came home happy. She had managed to buy a neck of mutton. It's the first meat she had seen for a month. She had walked from her suburban home into the bombed city center of Cologne, and had stood in line outside the butcher shop all morning. She had also forced herself to smile when the butcher, Herr Beckman, followed her behind. For if she had objected, he would have been sold out. To her afterwards. But she could put up with Beckman's wandering hands. She would get 3 days of meals out of a neck of mutton. I'm back, she sang out as she entered the house. The children were at school, but Dita was at home. She put the precious meat in the pantry. She would save it for tonight, when the children would be here to share it. For lunch, she and Dita would have cabbage soup and black bread. She went into the living room. Hello, darling, she said brightly. Her husband sat at the window, motionless. A piratical black patch covered one eye. He had on one of his beautiful old suits, but it hung loosely on his skinny frame, and he wore no tie. She tried to dress him nicely every morning, but she had never mastered the tying of a man's tie. His face wore a vacant expression, and a dribble of saliva hung from his open mouth. He did not reply to her greeting. She was used to this. Guess what? She said. I got a neck of mutton. He stared at her with his good eye. Who are you? He said. She bent and kissed him. We'll have a meaty stew for supper tonight, aren't we lucky? That afternoon, Flick and Paul got married in a little church in Chelsea. It was a simple ceremony. The war in Europe was over, and Hitler was dead, but the Japanese were fiercely defending Okinawa, and wartime austerity continued to cramp the style of Londoners. Flick and Paul both wore their uniforms. Wedding dress material was very hard to find, and Flick, as a widow, did not want to wear white. Pussythroat gave Flick away. Ruby was matron of honor. She could not be bridesmaid because she was already married to Jim, the firearms instructor from the finishing school. He was sitting in the second row of pews. Paul's father, General Chancellor, was best man. He was still stationed in London, and Flick had got to know him quite well. He had the reputations of an ogre in the U.S. military, but to Flick he was a sweetheart. Also in the church was Mademoiselle Jean Limas. She had been taken to Ravensbrück concentration camp with young Marie, and Marie had died there. But somehow Jean Limas had survived, and Pussythroat had pulled 100 strings to get her to London for the wedding. She sat in the third row, wearing a cloche hat. Dr. Claude Bowler had also survived, but Diana and Maud had both died in Ravensbrück. Before she died, Diana had become a leader in the camp, according to Mademoiselle Limas. Treating on the German weakness of showing deference to aristocracy, she had fiercely confronted the camp commandant to complain about conditions and demand better treatment for all. She had not achieved much, but her nerve and optimism had raised the spirits of the starving inmates, and several survivors credited her with giving them the will to live. The wedding service was short. When it was over and Flick and Paul were husband and wife, they simply turned around and stood at the front of the church to receive congratulations. Paul's mother was there, too. Somehow the general had managed to get his wife on a transatlantic flying boat. She had arrived late last night, and now Flick met her for the first time. She looked Flick up and down, obviously wondering whether this girl was good enough to be the wife of her wonderful son. Flick felt mightily put out, but she told herself this was natural in a proud mother, and kissed Mrs. Chancellor's cheek with warmth. They were going to live in Boston. Paul would take up the reins of his educational records business. Flick planned to finish her doctorate, then teach Americans youngsters about French culture. The five-day voyage across the Atlantic would be their honeymoon. Flick's ma was there, in a hat she had bought in 1938. She cried even though it was the second time she had seen her daughter married. The last person in the small congregation to kiss Flick was her brother Mark. There was one more thing Flick needed to make her happiness perfect. With her arms still around Mark, she turned to her mother, who had not spoken to him for 5 years. "Look, Ma," she said. "Here's Mark." Mark looked terrified. Ma hesitated for a long moment. Then she opened her arms and said, "Hello, Mark." "Oh, Ma," he said, and he hugged her. After that, they all walked out into the sunshine. That's it for Jackdaws. Hopefully you enjoyed the book. And see ya. Until the next time. Been Jackdaws by Ken Follett.